Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the lunch event by broadbandbreakfast.com. Will broadband succeed in changing the DNA of universities? Broadbandbreakfast.com is a news and events organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we have monthly breakfast events called the Broadband Breakfast Club at a local restaurant in downtown D.C. called Clyde's Gallery Place. And this is our first event outside of D.C. NCTA is a major sponsor of the Broadband Breakfast Club. But today, of course, we're having a lunch. And I'd like to thank NCTA for inviting us to present at the cable show. It's been a great experience. And I just want to give a hand to the NCTA. And the Cable Center as well, because they played a pivotal role in getting our event together. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Drew Clark. He's the founder and publisher of BroadbandBreakfast.com. Drew has a long-standing reputation for fairness and depth in reporting. He worked for the National Journal Group for 8 years, ran the Telecommunications and Media Ownership Project of the Center for Public Integrity, and was assistant director of the Information Economy Project at George Mason University. He has written widely on the politics of telecom, media, and technology for a variety of publications, including The Washington Post, GigaOM, Slate, and Ars Technica. Drew launched BroadbandCensus.com, the parent company for BroadbandBreakfast.com, in 2008 as a means of providing objective information about broadband speeds, prices, availability, reliability, and competition. Please join me in welcoming Drew Clark.
Thank you, Sylvia. This has been a wonderful and learning experience to be outside of our home base of Washington, and we really appreciate, as Sylvia mentioned, the support of the Cable Center and of NCTA. We have a really dynamic group of speakers who will participate in our interactive discussion. Part of our format is we want to involve the audience in the discussion. So as part of this, we will move to questions by each of you as soon as we can after a lively and interactive discussion about broadband and how it will succeed or not succeed in changing the DNA of universities. Let me go ahead and invite our panelists to come on up here, and I will introduce them as they do so. Each of you should, of course, feel free to continue with your dinners here, your lunch here. I suppose it is a little bit odd to be having broadband breakfast for lunch, but again, it's part of our learning effort to reach out and make sure that the goals and missions we have to build community around broadband policy and its impact on each of the major facets of our society is borne out in a fair and inviting and enlightening format. So from my right onwards, or from your right to left, we have David Weinberger. David's a senior researcher at the Berkman Institute and co-director of Harvard Library Innovation Lab. You have his full bio in front of you, but I just want to say I think David's one of the deepest thinkers about the web and Web 2.0 and whatever comes after Web 2.0. And I think that some of the works he's written about everything is miscellaneous, the power of the new digital disorder, is really helpful in framing the discussion that we want to have about knowledge and the role that universities have traditionally had as knowledge brokers and what interactive technologies that broadband enables will lead to. So thank you for joining us, David. Next, we have Jay Halfond, who's the Dean of the Metropolitan College and Extended Education at Boston University. We're really pleased to have officials from Harvard, Boston University, MIT, and Michigan here with us today. And Jay brings a great knowledge of online education, online learning, the role that broadband has from the student's perspective, and we'll certainly be talking about distance learning and its impact on the university and the university community. Next is Cecilia de Oliveira. She's the executive director of MIT OpenCourseware. And MIT and OpenCourseware, as many of you are familiar, really revolutionized the role of education and university education in putting vast volumes of content out in the open for many to experience. And so we'll be hearing from Cecilia what that experiment has wrought and what it betokens for future explorations and future activities, of which there are many right now. Next, we have Jerry Grochow. Jerry's the Interim Vice President for Internet 2, Net, and Services of Internet 2. Internet 2, of course, is one of the earliest super high-speed backbones that facilitates the kind of connectivity that major research universities need. And any discussion of higher education broadband really needs to include Internet 2. So we're really glad Jerry, who previously was the Chief Technology Officer, is that correct, at MIT? Chief Information Officer. The guy responsible for everything that went wrong with the network, right, Jerry? So we're really glad that you could be with us, Jerry. Thank you. And prize for coming the longest way among our panelists is Chuck Severance. Chuck's a clinical associate professor in the School of Information at University of Michigan, and he really brings a wealth of background to this subject and the role of broadband in the higher education landscape, of which there is much going on right now. So if you don't mind, I would love to turn to David first to speak a little bit about some of the observations you've made about knowledge and the role of universities traditionally, and perhaps some of the challenges they're facing as internet technologies become more and more entrenched in the society.
Okay. It's obviously a very broad question, which I will give an extremely shallow and I hope very short answer to. So one of the ways of looking at this is to consider knowledge as something that we have traditionally in the West modeled, not on purpose, on the limitations of paper as its medium. And so we've had a vision of knowledge in the West that views knowledge to a large degree as a type of content that has some characteristics which also mirror those of paper, that it's settled, because once you print something on paper, it's really hard to get the ink back off of it. It's highly filtered because paper is so expensive, and so very few people get to be professors of knowledge. I mean, people who profess to have and to put knowledge forward. And it's been, even though we all know that knowledge is highly connected and that academics and other experts in the world form networks and are social, nevertheless, once the knowledge is published, once it's fully sort of cooked and settled, has been published in a medium that is hugely disconnected. Books just physically are disconnected from the rest of every other book. At that point, they're floating free in the universe with some footnotes that nobody actually ever follows because it's too hard to go back to the library and chase down the footnote. I mean, some people do, but it's very rare that we do that. So we've had a system of knowledge that assumes that the vehicles of knowledge are stopping points. Effectively, they're stopping points. And so they have to give you everything that you need in order to understand it because it's just too hard to go out. And now all of that is flipped. Because the new medium, obviously, is the internet. I think it's obvious. And if anybody disagrees, I'm sure we'll hear about it. But the new medium for knowledge, it seems pretty clearly to me to be the internet. The internet has all the opposite properties of paper. It's hugely connected. It's not filtered by itself. There are lots of places on the web that usefully do curation, but the web by itself is open to anybody who wants to post. And so what we're seeing in the most optimistic sense, which I tend to favor, is knowledge taking on a more natural form, a form that is a better reflection of the nature of what it means to be a human being who's trying to know things, which is that the world is really, really big. It doesn't fit well into volumes. It doesn't divide up as neatly as books do. It is thoroughly a network. Knowledge is a network, which includes disagreement, and fruitfully does so. And anybody here who's on an old-fashioned mailing list, which I assume some of you are, knows this, or any of the other social forums. It's just a mailing list where people are talking about a topic over the course of months or years or decades in some cases. And the mailing list is enhanced by the fact that not everybody agrees. And that's a really simple example of a network, of a knowledge network. It is enhanced by the disagreement and difference. So now we have an opportunity in at least some of the aspects of how we teach and learn in universities to build knowledge networks quite explicitly and to benefit from them. And I think one of the questions today is going to be, well, okay, if you do that, then to what degree will the physical social environment of a university persevere? Just how much of the intellectual life and the educational tasks of a university can in fact take place in this new enhanced, as knowledge moves into the digital realm. How much of it can be accomplished in the digital realm, and how much of it really does need to have a group of people together in a common meeting space over the course of time.
Thank you. One of the ironies of our own organization, broadbandbreakfast.com, is that we are about broadband, build a community around broadband, and yet we meet in a physical space in Washington, D.C. on a monthly basis. And so there's a lot of interaction that comes from being in one place. So I guess with that comment thread, let's turn to Jay and ask, tell us a little bit about what distance learning does to the sociality, the social life of a university, and what the Metropolitan program, the Metropolitan College, how that approaches that issue.
Okay. Well, we've been involved in online distance learning for about 10 years now, and it's been an incredible learning experience. And our goal was always somewhat, I'll use the word conservative, in that we wanted to be able to offer full degrees online and ensure that we weren't degrading the brand of the university, and that we were able to justify the tuition we were charging and be able to justify the degree we were awarding. So our goal, our aspirations were always very high in that regard. And we wanted to be able to create or simulate or develop an environment online that somehow replicated or even improved upon what is offered in the traditional classroom. And so we now have about 14 programs fully online. We have over 3,000 students on a base of about 32,000 at Boston University. These students expect a rigorous, serious degree from a major research university. They expect student services to be provided. They expect to bond with one another and to form relationships with students and faculty that are comparable to what they would have if they were residentially on campus. And they wish to continue their own lives wherever they happen to be. And we have students in all 50 states and in about, I think, 40 or 50 countries. We have more students from California than from Massachusetts. And I'm just coming off of graduation weekend in which I met many of the students, some of whom were in Boston for the first time. They wanted to be on Commonwealth Avenue and buy sweatshirts at bookstores and things like that and meet one another. To the point we just heard, that there's still this need. But I find what we still talk about in words like community, interaction, participatory. It's not simply about knowledge transfer. It's not simply about taking something out of the brain of a professor and putting it into the brain of a student. It never has been in the classroom, in the physical classroom. It never should be in the online classroom as well. So I don't know what the next decade is going to bring for us, but I continue to think that we're building on the base of what makes a university great. We're not radically transforming it. We're, I hope, honoring it, and I hope improving upon it. And that's really our goal. And I think there are many, many advantages that we offer students, and they recognize that by enrolling and by paying our tuition.
Jay, let me ask you, dare I ask a business model question? Sure. Do you consider yourself in competition more with the rest of the university or other universities in Boston, or with the University of Phoenix that kind of is out there as a leading entity that aggressively promotes itself as a place where you can get your online course done if you can't come to a physical location?
Yeah. Well, on the first part of that question, most of our students come from major metropolitan areas. We have many students in San Francisco and LA and Chicago. We're basically competing with their choices locally as well as other online institutions. As far as the University of Phoenix comparison, this decade's been interesting. Maybe the first half of the decade, if I went to a party and someone asked me what I do and tried to free associate to that, they might say, oh, I'm like the University of Phoenix. And I'll just roll my eyes and say, you know, this conversation is going to be challenging. You know, now with Harvard and MIT in the press more and more, the response is, oh, like MIT. and so there's a significant change in the public perception of online learning, and there are more and more schools, University of Southern California, Northwestern University, Northeastern University, that are sort of within the bandwidth of Boston University that are engaged in this. That's the major change. The for-profits have been on the margins. They've dramatically increased. They're about 13% market share in higher education right now. The federal government has been after them because of all their mischief, and they're down, but they're not out. But I don't think, and to some extent, their decline they've blamed on us to some extent, which I don't think is true. But I think the landscape is getting very significantly different. But I don't hear the comparison to Phoenix any longer.
Well, and I think the landscape is very much changing if it hasn't already. Cecilia, my one-word question for you is why? Why did MIT do OpenCourseWare? What was the innovative thought that went into the people who were thinking, let's take all this ivory tower material that we used to put a wall and a $40,000 or $50,000 or $80,000 price behind and make it available for free?
Well, I think the answer is that came after a lot of deliberation. It wasn't obvious to begin with. There was a faculty group that actually studied this for well over a year, and I think most people assumed that the answer was going to be some form of online distance learning. But I guess the fact is, at that point in time, MIT faculty, when they proposed OpenCourseWare instead as an alternative, and just to be clear, OpenCourseWare, for those of you who don't know what it is the open sharing of classroom materials from MIT on the web. That's very simple idea. Just take what we use with our own students, put it online. When OpenCourseWare was first proposed 11 years ago, I think the feeling, in part, was we just didn't think it was time for online education. The technologies were too crude. The costs were too high. We didn't think that we could do an MIT quality job offering courses online. And so, but we didn't want to get left behind. I mean, MIT is a very let's get it done kind of place. And to take a total backseat while the world around us was changing didn't seem like a very good thing to do. And so what we did is, you know, said, let's just give our materials away and see what happens. And, you know, that wasn't, I mean, a lot of people said that was out of the blue, but the fact is, as we talked about this on campus and thought back about how does academia really work, it's actually consistent because, you know, we train graduate students at MIT who leave the institution and go off to become professors at Michigan, right? Or Harvard or BU. And oftentimes when they do, they would take their notes with them. They would take the course outline that they had TA'd for with them, and they'd use that as the basis for teaching a new course. And so OpenCourseWare was really using the internet to make that, that whole process worldwide, you know, in lightning speed. So we also felt, you know, as a university, if you look at universities like MIT, our mission isn't just to educate our own students. If you look at our mission statement, we're a research university. We feel as though we have a responsibility to advance knowledge and education around the world. And so, in some ways, this act was a way of taking a leadership role in terms of making our materials more available.
And what have you discovered as a result of it? How has it affected the culture of the professors and of the students inside and outside of MIT itself?
I think at MIT, there's two answers to that. The first is, I think we, through OpenCourseWare, have very firmly established that open sharing of education isn't a bad thing, that in fact it has lots of benefits that aren't even obvious on the surface. So for the institution itself, we certainly have seen benefits ranging from improvements in our own course materials, because if a professor is going to teach and only have a class of 20 people, they may not feel the need to brush their materials up too often. But if they're going to put their materials online and their peers are going to see it and thousands of people around the world are going to look at it every month, they're going to make sure that it's in better shape. So first of all, I think it's improved the actual quality. But secondly, I think it's affirmed for everyone at MIT the power of openness. And whether it's an individual faculty member who gets more recognition for what they're doing, or for the institution as a whole, the branding benefits that have come back to us are phenomenal, with our own alumni as well as with people on the other side of the world who will never have a chance to come to MIT. So inside the institution, I just think it's been perceived, you know, the feeling among our faculty, who are really the ones that make OCW possible, has been extremely positive. And I think that OpenCourseWare has really built the foundation as a result for us taking the next giant step. Now, outside of MIT, you know, we know that people appreciate the material. We get probably 1 million individual users come to our website every month. They don't typically view it as taking a course from MIT. You know, although we do have courses that have video lectures, most of the time they're looking for there's research in a particular topic. They might be someone who's a working professional that is interested in knowing something for an upcoming job that they're going to be doing, or could be a student who has a professor that isn't very good, and so they think, well, maybe MIT has something that'll explain this a little better. So, you know, over the last 10 years, we've put up materials from over 2,000 courses, and we've reached what we think is about 120 million people with our materials. And not all of that is over broadband, by the way. We find in Africa that we've actually got to put the content on hard drives and send it out, because things there are still pretty limited.
Well, that's a wonderful segue to Jerry Grochow. Jerry, what's your perspective on either the OpenCourseWare or the other issues that universities are facing from your perch at Internet 2 and the key role Internet 2 has played in providing the bandwidth needs to universities?
Well, you know, all of the things that are being talked about on this panel are, I think, possible because we now have much more connectivity and much more bandwidth available. Still not enough. I was just doing a speed test on the wireless here in this room, and I could barely get the needle to budge. So we have a ways to go. And by the way, this is the cable show, isn't it? So maybe wireless is not their thing, but you know, I think that you know, we really have to look to the future and the curve that we're on for expanding connectivity and this kind of capability. We've got in pockets of the world, and I would even say not all of the U.S., we have network connectivity that's capable of doing very high resolution video in real time. And when you think about changing education and you think about changing the university and what that means, I think that is what you're talking about. You're talking about the ability for multiple people to participate in real time with video, with audio, with ancillary materials, and so on. And that's not something that we have uniformly yet. The trends are there. We're on a Moore's law kind of curve for communication, and I have no doubt that that is going to become a standard. And just to take a look at Internet 2 as an example. Internet 2 was formed by some 20-odd universities about 15 years ago. It's now 230 universities plus a variety of commercial organizations and government agencies. The initial network was designed to provide 100 megabits of bandwidth. Today, routinely, schools are getting 10 gigabits of bandwidth, so that's 2 orders of magnitude. And the total capacity of the network, in other words, the number of bits that can be flowing at any particular time, is 8.8 terabits, and that's just in the US. That connects with similar kinds of networks, not necessarily quite as high speed, but moving in that direction in Europe, in Asia, in Canada, in various other parts of the world. So the total connectivity and the total amount of bandwidth is quite astounding. Now, we have to figure out how do we make that available to people who want to learn, who want to be educated? How do we make that available for places such as the universities represented on this panel that want to make their capabilities available to a much wider audience? We certainly are seeing that, again, starting in places. I have no doubt that a decade from now, bandwidth won't necessarily be the issue. We'll be talking about, well, what is a residential university when my residence has TV panels up and down the hallways and in every room, and as I walk around, I'm seeing people in other parts of the world who are part of my study group. And I think that's the kind of thing that we're moving toward. Well,
that's wonderfully provocative thoughts, and I want to turn to Chuck for a minute here and say, Chuck, tell us your view about what the next step is of taking material out into the broadband world so that education is going on over broadband.
Well, I think that we are reaching in kind of an interesting tipping point, that a lot of things, broadband being one of them, coming together. And as a teacher, I taught my first distance education class on the internet in 1995. And in 1995, my students had 28.8 modems, and so I had to take what I would normally do in a classroom, and I had to squeeze it and squeeze it and squeeze it and sort of take a lot of my cognitive effort as a teacher to make it small enough to fit through the connection that we had between us. And then the students, of course, had to then take that little tiny approximation of my class, and then they had to re-expand it in their heads to have a real class. And if you think of sort of distance education, even going back hundreds of years, it really is all about this, taking those things we can sort of do together and somehow compressing them. Even if you think of correspondence courses, there's a lot more work to compress a semester of education into a 3-ring binder that you're going to send back and have written assignment. So it's all this sort of cognitive compression and then cognitive re-expansion on the far end. And the tipping point that I'm talking about now is, and education really didn't drive it. YouTube drove it, Netflix drove it, but pretty much in most United States you can get 1080p video. People watch Netflix all the time, and what's really particularly cool as a faculty member is the kind of technology that I have now in my office. I've got high definition cameras. I can go make videos that are high definition. I can make it so that I can put myself on one side of the screen and my slides on another side of the screen, and I can scribble on it, and then I can cut away to some other thing. And I have a Macintosh computer that sits on my desktop that's got 4 processors and 8 gig RAM and a 500 gig SD. I am like the BBC basically. I am like my own personal BBC. If you go back 20 years, there was one BBC. Literally now, with some money, but a faculty member can equip themselves to be the BBC, which means that I now have an effect, a pipeline, where I can control every pixel on a laptop at a distance, at a great distance. Now, what am I going to do with that? That we still got to work through. We still have to work through that. But the moment that it's a tipping point of a bunch of things that are happening at the same time. But the moment that I can make something in my office and control every pixel at a distance, high quality audio, high quality video, how then can I use that to teach? And that's what I think is triggered these new MOOCs, these massively online open courses like edX from MIT and Harvard, for Coursera.
This was just announced this month,
right?
edX
and so the fact that we've hit this tipping point means that an idea that it's a fine idea, there wasn't enough technology to make it trivial. Things even like the software called Camtasia and ScreenFlow and the software to build this stuff. It's just there and it costs $99 and I have adequate storage and adequate compute power. And all of a sudden it just becomes something I can be creative with rather than something I'm fighting the technology. And so this is why there's so many of these things popping up, just sort of like flowers or weeds, however you think about it, to explore the new space. And so the early adopters, I, of course, am a crazy early adopter, always have been, always will be. But the early adopters, we're going to colonize it really fast, and we're going to make mistakes. We're going to figure out what works. We're going to figure out what doesn't work. But after this tipping point, and if we can create the kind of engaging remote learning experiences that I'm quite confident we're going to be able to create, it will change our DNA, right? It will change how we think about teaching, how we as faculty members think about our own teaching. And we will move to some next level. That we're not done with this yet, but we are starting some real exciting new things. When you think about my course that's starting July 23rd, I have 12,000 students in.
This is on Coursera, right?
Yeah, on Coursera.
And University of Michigan is part of Coursera.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Harvard and MIT are part of edX. We also spoke a little bit about Udacity.
Yep.
Cecilia, Jay, what do you think about these new efforts? Where are they going?
I guess I'm a little bit more, stand back and watch. I think there's going to be a lot of experiments, as Chuck said. I'm not sure the BBC model is the one that I would think of. That still sounds to me too much like, you're sitting there and just kind of taking a news read or something, and doesn't sound very interactive to me. But it is exciting. I mean, and clearly, if you've had an opportunity to look at some of these massive online courses that Stanford has made available or MIT has made available, the students that are taking part of them seem to be very, very positive about them. And it could be that, I haven't seen any demographics of folks yet. I know the MIT course looks like a lot of folks from outside the U.S., and I think they're just excited about being able to get a real live MIT type experience that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. I'm not sure from an MIT student perspective, if you were to compare the two, the online course versus the MIT course, I mean, I'm still very skeptical because there's so much, at least at MIT, if you look at education at MIT, it's not just stuffing people's head with content. So much of what goes on as a student at MIT has to do with the interactions you have with other students in the dorm late at night, or with a faculty member who you run into in the hallway, or in our research labs. MIT as a research university, I think, has built its curriculum around that. And so for maybe for students who are sitting on the other side of the world and don't have access to that, these online courses are going to be really, really cool. But at MIT, what we're trying to do, I think, with edX, which is one of the questions you didn't ask, yes, we really want to understand how this online stuff works so that we can adapt the good parts of it for our own students. Again, it's one of those, we don't want to be left behind. Things are moving very quickly and we want to be a part of the experiment. But you know, I don't see that MIT as an institution is at all at risk of being replaced, because so much of what we do is just not replicable online.
Jay, do you have a thought about these new ventures?
Well, I too don't feel that it's necessarily a zero-sum game, that we're dealing with necessarily a series of alternatives. I think the higher education mosaic is very, very complicated. I think I welcome experimentation. I think there's an advantage at times to not being an early adopter and kind of seeing what works and how it works, and then stealing the best ideas. And so I think over time, I think this is going to help in a number of ways. I think it's going to help us become better teachers, first of all, and as has been mentioned, this ultimately is about something that doesn't even involve technology. It's about teaching. It's about learning. It's about how one best uses resources and opportunities and lifestyles of students to create the most robust educational experience possible. So I think it's going to make better teachers of us, no matter what medium we happen to use. Secondly, I think it's going to help us come up with better definitions. Definitions of what does a course mean? How is course material different from a course? How is a series of courses different than a degree? How does one price these different things within higher education? And that's going to become a very, very interesting debate and discussion, because it's going to put pressure, frankly, on traditional universities that are trying to offer full online degrees to really explain why you should pay $40,000 versus zero in some cases, or very little for an alternative way of learning. And I think it's going to harken back to differentiating between a free library and going to school for a degree. So I think this is going to raise a lot of good discussion and debate within higher education, but I don't see the apocalypse occurring quite yet. I think we're dealing with an expansion of learning globally that frankly can't be accommodated by the BUs and MITs of the world. That there are more students that qualify for MIT and other elite universities than we can ever serve. So I think this is going to be a fantastic way in which we're going to find alternative ways of bringing education globally, which in turn will improve upon the environments that we have here. And I think it's not only do we need to not see this as a zero-sum in terms of pedagogy and how teaching is conducted and where it's conducted, but we also need to remember that not all types of students can learn in the same way. That most of us would probably not want to send our 18-year-old children or nieces and nephews to a fully experimental environment at this point. We still revere the traditional residential campus, but that doesn't mean that's going to survive at the expense of more experimental models which can accommodate adult learners and individuals globally who don't have access.
You know, in some respects, this may be veering towards two different approaches to learning. One is the liberal arts place, where we come together, the social aspects, it's in a place, and the other is it's an economic product that U.S. dominates over the rest of the world, so how can we expand our brand share, our mind share? What universities, I mean, wouldn't an MIT or a Boston University be very well poised to be the world's university? I mean, what do some of the other panelists think about this tension or this dilemma or the way higher education is emerging?
Well, let me just say a word about where things are. Working for Internet 2, I'm part of a very dispersed organization, but I meet with my colleagues every day. The fact that we have people who choose to live in practically every major city and some minor ones across the country doesn't affect how we operate as an organization, and we're not unique in this. There are other organizations doing that as well. Well, extend that to the university. Yes, there are some things that I can get by being in residence, but maybe I don't need to be in residence all the time. Maybe I can be in residence part of the time. There are some universities, Goddard College up in Vermont, for example, has what they call a low residency model, where you're there, I think, a couple of weeks a semester, and then the rest of the semester is done in remote sessions that make use of technology and make use of bandwidth and video and so on. So when we start to think about an MIT being a world's university, or other universities in that sense, from other parts of the world extending their reach into the US, I think we have to think in terms of, again, the way in which technology allows us to operate more broadly without being physically present, at least not all the time.
David, please.
Well, two things. First is that if online education continues to gain traction, then I think it actually opens up a market, and a very disruptive market for the established brands. It's much easier to conceive of a university surging forward because of the quality of its teaching and because of its understanding and perhaps innovation in how online teaching happens. I mean, it'll be we hope, a very large marketplace of ideas and courses and texts. The other thing is I'd like to mention is something that's happening outside of universities that I think is, I'm about to use the word synergistic, and I apologize. So if you look at how software developers learn, I think it's arguable that they have developed for themselves the best, at least most efficient learning environment in human history. That if you want to get smart as a software developer online, the tools that are there are astounding. Among the tools are, you have a question, it's because we're at scale here, it's increasingly unlikely that you are the first or only person to have ever had this question, so it's very, very likely that somebody else has answered it. And so you'll Google it or whatever, and you'll go to a site, and they're like Stack Overflow, for example. And there you will find people who are asking, and then a whole bunch of answers, and then iterations on the answers, saying, well, that's good, but actually it doesn't work in Internet Explorer. Here's how you fix that. And at the end of this process, you have the actual code. The person asking the question, or anybody comes afterwards, can simply take. So part of the ethos here is among developers has been an openness and a generosity that says, in part, that learning ought to be a public act, not the improvement of an individual by a teacher, and the improvement of that individual then leads to a better public because we have an educated citizen now, but rather that the act of education itself ought to be something that directly improves the public. And so learning something by yourself and not sharing it, answering one of these questions in a direct message to the person who's asking it so that that person gets better but the rest of the community doesn't, is perceived as an act of selfishness. And this type of this idea that education, the process of learning and of education itself ought to be a public act, and that keeping it behind walls is an act of selfishness that's making the world worse, is both coming from and leaking into, this is the synergy word, into educational institutions. So that what used to be seen, just of course education is a teacher and a student, it's in a closed classroom, and thanks very much for things like OpenCourseWare, which has just been a magnificent contribution. That default is changing, and when that default changes, then I think we will have a pretty thorough rethinking of what it means to be educated, how to educate, and what the role of a university is.
Wow. Well, what do you think, Cecilia?
I just want to throw one other thought out there, which is, one of the things that I think we've come to realize through OpenCourseWare is if you start to peel apart what is the product that the university provides, at some level you can think about the knowledge, the content. At another, second to that then would be things that you might say are learning activities or interactions or things that students do to really internalize and develop not just a sense of the knowledge, but how that knowledge fits in terms of the world and et cetera. And then the third piece, the actual, what some people term certification. So a degree or a certificate or something of that sort that demonstrates what you've learned. And those three things are all very different. And I think one of the things in the open education world that people have been experimenting with is having partnerships where content comes from one place, and perhaps the interaction with a group to really learn the stuff, to master it, to absorb it, happens somewhere else.
So
and then certification is at the end, and maybe that's a third party. Now, you know, I don't know if I want to throw my 18-year-old kids who are going off to Georgetown in the fall into that kind of soup. I like the idea of they're going to a traditional university. But the fact is that in the online world, these things are happening. And you can go to OpenCourseWare and get the content, and then you can go to OpenStudy and be part of a study group that talks about the content. And then, you know, maybe you can go somewhere else and take a test and get some kind of certificate that says you actually learned something.
So instead of universities being the vertically integrated model of content production and distribution, we could have open universities that take content from lots of places. What we like to do is get your comments and questions in here. So please feel free to raise your hand, and we will get questions in and continue this important discussion.
In playing the kind
would you mind just identifying yourself?
Yeah, excuse me. I'm Chuck Patty from the University of Denver and the Cable Center. So the question has to do with your perceptions of the role of learning technology in playing the kind of social maturing role that universities play. Because I think a good bit of the reason, of course, we know that students come when they're 18 years old, and all students, of course, aren't 18, but they come and they learn to grow up. Is this possible by way of technology? Because I think so much of the discussion about online learning is about content. And it's not about learning, it's not about critical thinking, it's not about motivation, inspiration. Those things are somehow bypassed by most of the people who talk about this. Not you today, but I think many colleagues certainly, that's what they think about is content and not these other social aspects.
Please.
A quick comment. I think you're giving us too much credit for actually helping in maturation of 18 to 22-year-olds when they actually come to campus.
Something happens.
Right, but it might happen anyway. Who knows? But no, we certainly like to take credit whenever a 22-year-old is different than an 18-year-old, and that incremental difference, we somehow believe it's something that we've done positively. I do believe that that's probably the hardest element to ever try to replicate exclusively using technology as the medium. On the other hand, if you think about lifelong learners, in which we always have to develop, we don't simply get from 18 to 22 and then stop. That we're moving through life. That increasingly that life is going to be conducted on the internet, and that we need to be able to develop the social skills and the interactive ability and the communication capabilities to not just share ideas in a civil way, but to actually be productive. For example, we have a project management master's degree online, which for me, the medium is the message, in a sense, that many of us work in such virtual environments anyway that we need to learn how to collaborate online. And so I think the technology actually is better than actually making people get together to learn in some cases. So I think there's subject matter in which you could actually improve upon the social experience, because it's more of a simulation of what life is going to be like beyond that. A quick example. Many of our universities brag about how international we are, and Boston University has more international students than any other school in New England. MIT has a very high percentage of foreign students. I would argue that's not really a global environment, that we really don't attract representative people from other parts of the world. We largely attract people who can pay a lot of money and who have really high proven academic ability to come to our schools. But imagine if we really could create a more global classroom online that we simply can't do now. embarrass David for a second. His daughter joined a really fine public health program at Boston University, but it's not online. And so she won't have the experience of interacting with professionals in other parts of the world. Imagine what the quality of that program if she could be interacting with public health officials in India and Africa and other places as part of her educational experience. So I wouldn't put our residential campus on a pedestal necessarily.
Question right here.
I was also going to comment that even on the residential campus, you've got a large number of students that are working almost full-time in order to be able to pay the bills, and they don't get the same kind of socialization that students who mother and dad are paying for the education get. Likewise, to the extent that you've got more of a commuter campus situation, those students don't get that. So if they're living at home, just as an example, they don't get the same kind of socialization experiences. So, you know, we have, I don't know what percentage of our students are getting that full bore 50% out of the, you get, you know, half your education is outside the classroom experience, but you know, it's not as utopian as we might think, too. So,
Chuck.
Yeah, you mentioned, the earlier question mentioned critical thinking, and a lot of these early highly scalable classes have been in rather technical domains, and what is knowledge is pretty straightforward. If you're going to do electrical engineering, it's got a resistor and what's the voltage, and you can learn that stuff, and it's a skill. What I'm excited about, in particular in Coursera, is that we're doing humanities classes, we're doing classes in science fiction. The class I'm teaching, even though I'm a computer scientist, is a class on history, where I'm not just going to sit and rattle off a bunch of dates, but I've actually got video of the people who did these cool innovations, and I'm going to introduce them, and then I'm going to have the students attack sort of the history from whatever perspective they want to attack it, and do I think, am I sure this is going to work? No, I'm not sure that this is going to work at all, but once you kind of eliminate lots of the technical barriers of just kind of getting from point A to point B, then you can say, can I make this be about critical thinking? Can I make this be a liberal arts kind of a class? Can I make, and you know, can I make it one of these mind-blowing freshman classes where kids come out of it and change their major after they take one class? I don't know, but once the kind of nasty little technical details are kind of handled, then your brain can stop thinking about that and wonder. And so we've got some of our, at Michigan, some of our craziest, nuttiest, most inspirational teachers are going to try online. Now, will there be gaskets that break and things that fail? Of course there's going to be. Will we learn from that? Of course we're going to learn from that. So I think that we shouldn't just think of this as Microsoft certification or Cisco certification. I think that to go to the beginning of your question about the social and the friendship, I think that's the hardest thing to get. And Jay kind of did talk about the fact that they've explicitly worked on that. I think for master's students in their late 20s, it's easier than for 18-year-olds. So I don't want to say that we're going to attack that, but I think there's a lot of the other things that are take and move learning towards a bit of education, right? That the synthesis that is cross-class. I think we're going to try it. I mean, I think that we're not going to just take the easy stuff and teach algebra online or teach writing online, because that's been done a lot. But try to teach a history class that requires critical thinking and do that at scale with 12,000 students.
Chuck, on that 12,000 students, how are you going to get them to interact?
Coursera has these things where you make assignments, so they got to kind of run through each other and they got to do all this stuff. I'm not exactly sure how it all works, and I'm not sure it's going to work perfectly the first time.
Self-forming social networks?
Exactly.
By Facebook groups or by...
No. They'll just kind of have to grade each other's work and comment on each other's work, and then they'll be graded on the commenting. And there's a whole bunch of research on this kind of stuff. And I'm not saying it's a slam dunk. I'm not saying it's going to work. What I'm saying is we're throwing ourselves at the problem because the other problems aren't the problem anymore. That's what I'm saying. And it's a kitty hawk, right? It's just the beginning. And I'm a computer scientist teaching a history class where I'm going to try to do critical thinking. I give myself 50% chance of success.
Cecilia.
Yeah, I just want to say that what I think is so exciting now is that instructors, teachers, faculty at our institutions are actually thinking about these things. They're thinking about the educational process. They're thinking about how to teach this subject in a different way, which maybe hasn't happened in quite a long time. It's just a time of a lot of excitement, I think, and there are going to be failures. And there are some skeptics, me among them, that think that the humanities side, you know, I just don't see how this is going to work. But there are people that are going to try, and we'll see what comes out of it. So, you know, I just think it's amazing. It's an amazing period of time.
Well, you said Kitty Hawk moment a little bit ago. That's a great analogy. We have questions in here and then right over there.
Yeah, Richard Taylor from Penn State University, as you all know, a large public university with many fine students who would no doubt be at Harvard and MIT, but for circumstance, and many, 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 many other students who are probably not the best candidates for that. And it's more a structural issue, moving away from the content and the motivational and so forth, which in the initial conversation only came up momentarily at the end from Cecilia, which is accreditation and certification. You know, who gets to give away these degrees, and how do we decide what they're worth and how do you get them? I mean, dealing regularly with classrooms full of 19-year-olds, you ask them why they're there to get a degree. And if they say, I'm actually here to learn something I'm passionate about learning, their parents will tell you that they are there to get a degree, right? Absolutely. So it's all nice to have sort of open, you know, classes posted and all this sort of thing, but the real, you know, how do you then come around with that and mesh with the sort of structures of society that said that at 22 this kid should walk out of here with a piece of paper that says he's entitled to a certain kind of job?
Who wants to take that? Go ahead, Chuck.
I'll jump first. So one of the things at the University of Michigan that we're very worried about when participating in something like Coursera is in fact giving away that which we sell, right? You take my class for free. They're not even worried about the certification. Just having me is apparently worth something to some set of students somewhere. So it's really critical for University of Michigan to participate in Coursera to make sure that there's sort of this differentiated credential, right? There's going to be no credit. There's going to be no University of Michigan credit. Coursera may decide at some point to give like a badge or something for the class. And then the question that we would ask ourselves at the University of Michigan is, you know, 10 Michigan Coursera badges and 2 Princeton Coursera badges and 4 Penn badges and 5 Stanford badges, is that going to compete with our degree? And I would say that if you had somebody with 20 badges from 4 schools up against a person with an MIT bachelor's competing for a job, the person with the MIT is going to get, the degree is going to get the job. But I think that there are literally millions and millions and millions of people around the world that aren't going to make it to MIT or Michigan or Princeton, and they need credentials as well. And so I do believe that there will be large amounts of this world for which 20 badges, whether they're from edX or Coursera or whatever, will actually put you at the top of the employment pool in that situation. And so I just don't think that we can, at the elite universities, educate enough people and give them enough credentials. So I think that we don't really lose all that much by letting this second tier of very good credentials that are going to be highly useful in perhaps 95% or 80% of the world will be extremely useful, and they'll be considered first-class credentials in that 80% of the world. And still in the 20% of the world, it's a little more competitive, and you need kind of a more solid, rigorous, boring 200-year-old place to give you a credential. Yeah, that's a good question. So that's the magic of the MITx software, the Coursera software, and the Udacity software, in that it really has to be peer education. You've got to structure your assessment to be peer-based, because in Coursera, we're specifically not supposed to hover in our classes, right? Because the University of Michigan does not want to give me a course buyout to teach this class either, right? And so I'm not supposed to hover in my class. We're supposed to stick around for the first couple of times to see if it fails, and we have to fix pieces. But in general, and we've seen this in some of the classes, Scott Page, University of Michigan, taught a class, and I tried to keep up with it. I didn't have enough time to keep up with it. I'm one of the like 90% dropouts of most of these MOOC courses. But there were things like a Zurich study group that showed up. He had like 20,000 students in the class, and there was enough in Zurich that there were like 8 or 9 people that were helping each other in Zurich to get through the class. So I think this is the kind of thing we'll see, these dynamic small groups. When you get to 12 to 20 to 100,000, you can start creating sort of dynamic self-help groups. And frankly, when you're taking a chemistry class with 1,000 of your closest friends, you're going to make a study group anyways. And so that's kind of how it all works. And so this is where I think these Coursera, MIT X Udacity things are not necessarily education as much as learning, but it's possible you're going to need some peer support, et cetera. And so it's structured in a way that is not exactly competitive with what we do on our campus.
Can I just add a
Please
couple
go ahead,
things?
Cecilia.
So I wanted to go back to the question the Penn State fellow asked. And one thing we haven't talked about is business models. You know, how can you have these free courses, right, and make those available? And I think the answer to that sort of ties into this issue of the certificate. And of course, this is all still speculation at this point because these things are so new. But what has been talked publicly, I know, on Udacity's side, which is one of the 3 platforms right now, and on the MIT side, is that there's some sense that if we can make these certificates actually legitimate, and how would we do that? Well, you know, we'd have to make sure that the people who take the exams, we know who they are, that they're legitimately taking the exams so that we know they know what they're doing. If we can do that, if we can make them legitimate, then they will have value. And if then, you know, perhaps we could become a matchmaker somehow with companies that are looking for people who have excelled in certain areas, and we know that they've excelled because it's our exam, it's legitimate, you know, we know who the person is. We can sort of vouch for them. We can establish a connection, and maybe corporate world will end up funding some of this.
MIT, the new headhunter.
That's, you know, that may be.
A broker or information.
A broker. I think a broker is
a talent broker.
Information is always valuable, right? Information and knowledge, who these people are, how smart they are, what their skill set is, that's valuable to somebody.
Question right here.
Well, it's a question and a comment, and I'm
If
glad
you could
that
just
you
identify yourself.
I'm sorry, I'm Lorraine Branham. I'm the dean of the Newhouse School at Syracuse University, and I thought your comments about the certification was important because I think most of the people I hear talking about online education, they don't just want a badge. They want a degree, and I think that's part of the popularity of the University of Phoenix. This is a way you can get a degree and continue your job and whatever. And many schools are looking at degree programs. I'm looking at in fact, I'm in the process of developing a master's program that will be online. But we're also in this crisis in higher education right now involving the cost of higher education, and you all are high-priced schools like Syracuse University. And so I wonder, can online education be an answer for lowering the cost of higher education, or are we just going to be $60,000 a year schools that are now online?
Well, I will say one thing. When I was still at MIT directly, we were looking very carefully at the cost of education, particularly during the financial crises that we all went through, most recently just a couple of years ago. And this invariably led to a discussion of productivity. And someone said, well, as long as you know, our faculty student ratio is 1 to 7 or so, and as long as a faculty member is going to teach 20 students or supervise 4 PhD theses, there's only so much you can do about productivity. Well, then I was talking to one of our faculty members who was teaching a course, actually a joint course up at Harvard, and he said 100 students enrolled in that class, and by the 3rd session, there were only 20 coming to the class, so that kind of made the point, except that they had posted the lectures online and 10,000 people had seen the lectures. So all of a sudden, and now the first course in MIT X had 120,000 people. Granted, 90% dropout rate, but okay. That's still
20,000.
That's still, you know, 10, 12,000 people who made it through the midterm, and as I heard it, made it through the midterm with higher grades than many MIT students made it through the midterm. Now you're talking productivity that no one had dreamed of before, and that relates to the cost of education.
But did it lead to anything?
Did it lead to anything?
Is anyone considering lowering their costs on the higher education level because they're doing more online? Jay?
We actually charge a slight premium for going online. Well, no, I mean, I say that seriously because I think if our motive was to either make a lot of money or save a lot of money, I think we wouldn't have done a very good job from the start. That was never a serious part of the motivation. Now, I think over time, fewer classroom buildings can be built. There'll be you can better tap faculty expertise, such that if a faculty member develops a really cool class, that can be leveraged over a greater number of students. But I think if you go into it with that motive in mind, I think it's going to get corrupted pretty quickly. Because to the Penn State question, our goal has been to not differentiate our online programs in any stigmatizing way. When I gave out diplomas on Saturday night, I didn't say the online students stand over here, or we'll get to you at the end after we graduate the real students, or something like that. No, and there's no footnote on the diploma. There's nothing different, and I think I think that's really our ideal, our aspiration, and so I think over time we'll figure out ways, I hope, of containing the cost of higher education, because I think it is a bubble that's about to burst.
Question?
Mike Worth, University of Tennessee. I was going to ask, if this idea scales, of course, I mean, you could have many fewer universities, and the professor from Harvard who's the world's greatest expert, or from MIT, or from whatever university, could, if it scaled, could teach everybody in the world, and you have a team of people to grade. And so where does that leave the traditional model for higher education?
And let me just build on that question with a discussion of K through 12 education and the attention that the Khan Academy has gotten lately, and being able to get so many people watching apparently very effective instruction, but then there often is an adjunct component to that. So let me add that secondary education question here to build on that one, which is, are we going to see major transformations with universities becoming bigger and other smaller ones dying off?
Well, I just signed my son up for some summer classes, and we went to ratemyprofessor.com. And we didn't go to ratemyserver.com. And he's 18 years old, and he needs a human to learn. And so like many people here, we send our own children to humans who we like and believe are inspirational and can change our children's way of thinking, right? And then after I'm done with that, I walk into my room and I create a thing for 12,000 students around the world. I think those two things, when it's all said and done, are going to work out in a market that they're complementary, right? Absolutely complementary. I just think that we're going to find ways to take my course, bust it into pieces. Khan Academy is a perfect example. You use a couple of videos with a real teacher. The teacher keeps track. The Khan Academy helps keep track. It's just as Khan Academy is most successful when it's an enhancement rather than a replacement to a real teacher. And I think that we're going to just see the exact same thing. And all of this stuff, it's going to be an enhancement to super awesome teachers around the world. And there is no one world university. There is no best professor in the world. And so I think that we're not going to see that kind of oversimplification where you just take the slider bar and go all the way to the end and then shut all the universities down and just have servers. What education is changes all the time, right? Yeah, okay, calculus hasn't changed for a little while, and that's why Pearson teaches most kids calculus, frankly, with my things like my math lab, but there's not a lot of my math labs out of there, right? My social media marketing. I mean, there's not a thing from Pearson that teaches social media marketing because it turns out it changes so rapidly. And you know, just anything interesting is so subject to change. To imagine that we can bake it in and stick it in a server and then lay off all the people who are smart enough to make new material. I think that's the fallacy. And frankly, when I started doing this in 96, 97, that's what everyone thought, right, in 96, 97. And I thought those people were crazy, right, to say we can lay off the teachers. I don't think we're going to lay off the teachers in this. We're just going to teach a lot more students, right? We're not going to have any fewer teachers needed. We're going to need more teachers rather than fewer teachers, but we're going to teach far more students by the time all these things kind of find their way into the market.
I just want to add one comment, and that is if you look at MITx, and I don't know if this is true for Coursera or not, most of the 90,000 or 100,000 or however many people there are who signed up for that course are actually not 18-year-old students. Most of these people are adult learners who have jobs, or maybe they want to have a job, and they're using these opportunities not as to replace traditional education, because they wouldn't go down and register for a traditional course. This is just a learning enhancement. And so I think I agree completely with Chuck that this is not a threat. I mean, we are approaching a time where we don't just have Wikipedia, but we have, you know, a Wikipedia of all the great lecturers in the world, and that's great. But it's not going to replace, you know, for most of us, it's not going to replace traditional education for 18-year-old kids.
One last subject I want to get in is libraries and the role that libraries play. And David, could you just speak a little bit about the Harvard Library Innovation Lab and what role you see it and others playing in the educational mix?
So I'm co-director of a very small group at Harvard Library called the Library Innovation Lab, which is a few developers who are extraordinarily bright and good-natured, and they create interesting software. Some of it's experimental, some of it's sort of an art project, it's a provocation, and some of it is useful innovation, very practical. We're now also working very closely with the Digital Public Library of America, which is, you can Google it, I'll leave it there, or dp.la if you want. And I think that one of the things that is interesting to me about this is the Harvard Library System is not famous for its openness. I'm looking at Chuck, the librarian, you know, the library science guy, among other things. It's not famous for its openness, and the institution of this lab is part of a pretty concerted effort on the part of Harvard to rethink itself, of the Harvard Library System, to rethink itself as an open environment insofar as it can be, and a lot of baby steps, but it's still it's a real thing, and the way that so you have a set of extremely competent, really great librarians at Harvard. I mean, it's a wonderful library system and library technologists. And their jobs, especially in the technology side, has been to build a back end that supports a pretty large library system, and which they do wonderfully. Over the past 3-5 years, it has become, there's been a sea change, so that rather than simply seeing themselves as supporting a back-end infrastructure, they're increasingly seeing themselves as supporting a platform that's open to all of Harvard and increasingly open to the rest of the world, Godspeed with that, that makes what Harvard libraries know about stuff available to as many people as possible. And it is a real change in how the system thinks about itself, whether it's a closed system that's supporting at maximum efficiency a very complex and wonderful library system, or whether it's an open system that has benefit, of course, still has to support all of the things it was supporting, but insofar as it can get additional benefit out to the world by making itself open, then it will. And I think this is an exact mirror of what we've been talking about here when it comes to courses. Our universities are going to continue to support amazingly good in-class, on-campus courses, but at the very least, when we can make those benefits available to the rest of the world, then it's irresponsible of us not to do so.
We're rapidly approaching the end of our time, but before we thank our panelists, is there any of our panelists who'd like to offer any concluding thoughts on our discussion that we've had here today? Please.
I'd just like to say one thing. We've been talking about higher ed and how technology impacts that. I mean, let's remember that there are many, many experiments going on. And some of those experiments will fail, and some of them will succeed, and others will morph. And the experiments about learning and education are not just going on sponsored by our higher education institutions. When you've got almost 1 billion people every day logging onto Facebook, you've got experiments going on in education. Maybe not learning, but definitely in education. And, you know, these are some of the things that broadband and other technologies have brought to us, and I have no doubt there are going to be many more that we can't even imagine as our children grow and as their children grow with all of the things that technology can provide.
Great. Well, did anyone else want to add anything? Want to just remind you, if you enjoyed this panel discussion, to visit broadbandbreakfast.com. You can see videos of this presentation as well as our monthly forums that are in Washington, D.C., and sign up to receive our news updates as well. We want to recognize our sponsor, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, for this special event of the broadbandbreakfast.com, and also thank our friends at the Cable Center for all their help. And most importantly, want to give a big round of applause to our panel, to Chuck and Jerry and Cecilia, Jay and David. So thank you.